In a landmark decision handed down on August 12, 2025, the Supreme Court struck down the controversial Trump-era tariffs, a move that immediately captured the nation's attention and set off a wave of reactions across the political spectrum. The announcement sent shockwaves through both Washington and Wall Street, as lawmakers, investors, and business leaders scrambled to assess the far-reaching implications of the court's ruling. By overturning these tariffs, the Supreme Court dismantled a central pillar of the America First economic policy, signaling a dramatic shift in how the United States approaches international trade and the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. The decision reverberated not only through global financial markets but also in corporate boardrooms around the world, as companies and governments alike rushed to adapt to the new legal and economic landscape. For years, these tariffs had sparked fierce debate, igniting protests, fueling legal battles, and dividing policymakers over the best path forward for American trade policy. Originally imposed on imports from China and several U.S. allies, the tariffs were justified under laws that granted the president broad authority to act in the name of national security or to counter what was deemed unfair trade practices. However, critics from both sides of the aisle argued that this was a significant overreach, allowing the executive branch to sidestep Congress's constitutional power to regulate commerce and levy taxes, a power explicitly granted to the legislative branch by the Constitution. American businesses, importers, and even some exporters challenged the tariffs in court, claiming they led to higher costs for consumers, disrupted critical supply chains, and provoked retaliatory measures from foreign governments, ultimately harming the U.S. economy. In a decisive 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court found that the executive branch had exceeded its statutory authority, ruling that the president's actions went beyond what Congress had originally intended when it passed the relevant trade laws. The majority opinion emphasized that the statutes in question had been stretched far beyond their original intent, warning that unchecked executive power in trade matters could undermine the constitutional separation of powers. This historic ruling not only eliminates the tariffs in question, but also fundamentally redefines the legal landscape for future presidential actions on trade, setting a precedent that will shape U.S. economic policy for years to come. The court's decision sends a clear and unmistakable message: the power to levy broad-based taxes on imports and to make sweeping changes to trade policy belongs to Congress, not the president. With this ruling, the era of unilateral presidential tariffs has come to a decisive end, ushering in a new chapter in American trade policy, one where Congress is once again at the center of the nation's economic decisions. To fully grasp the Supreme Court's decision on trade, it's crucial to understand what tariffs are, how they function, and why they matter in the broader context of international commerce. Tariffs are just one of many tools governments use to influence trade, but they're among the most visible and controversial. At its core, a tariff is a tax imposed by a government on imported goods and services. When a product crosses a border into a country, the government may require the importer to pay a fee, which is then added to the cost of the product. The main goal of a tariff is to make foreign imports more expensive, which in turn boosts the appeal of products made within the country. This can encourage consumers to buy domestic goods, supporting local businesses and industries. Tariffs are a classic form of protectionism, a policy designed to shield local industries from foreign competition. There are several types of tariffs, each with its own impact on trade and the economy. The first is the ad valorem tariff, which is calculated as a percentage of the value of the imported item. For example, a 10% tariff on a $100 product means the importer pays an extra $10. The second type is the specific tariff, which is a fixed fee charged for each unit of the imported good, regardless of its price. This could be, for instance, $2 for every shirt or $50 for every ton of steel. Finally, there's the compound tariff, which combines both a percentage of the value and a fixed fee per unit, making it a more complex but sometimes more effective tool. No matter the type, the effect of tariffs is almost always to raise the final price that consumers pay for imported goods. This can make everyday items from electronics to groceries noticeably more expensive. Supporters of tariffs argue that these measures protect young or struggling industries, help counteract unfair foreign trade practices, and can even foster job growth by encouraging companies to produce more domestically. They believe tariffs can level the playing field, making it possible for domestic businesses to compete with large, often subsidized foreign companies, and ultimately protect American jobs and communities. On the other hand, opponents, including most economists, argue that tariffs ultimately harm the economy. They point out that tariffs raise consumer prices, reduce purchasing power, and can disrupt supply chains, making goods less accessible. In some cases, tariffs can even trigger damaging trade wars, where countries retaliate by imposing their own tariffs, escalating tensions, and hurting businesses on both sides. This ongoing debate over the costs and benefits of tariffs is why trade policy remains so contentious, with strong arguments and passionate voices on both sides of the issue. The Trump administration's tariffs were central to its America First agenda. Starting in 2018, the administration broke from decades of free trade policy. The goals: reduce the trade deficit, bring back manufacturing jobs, and pressure China to change unfair practices. Tariffs became the main weapon in this economic confrontation. In March 2018, the U.S. imposed a 25% tariff on steel and 10% on aluminum, citing national security. Allies like Canada and the EU strongly disputed the national security claim. The most sweeping tariffs targeted China, eventually covering over $360 billion in goods. China retaliated, hitting U.S. exports, especially agriculture, hard. This strategy replaced negotiation with unilateral action and confrontation. While a Phase 1 deal was signed with China, most tariffs remained, creating a new uncertain status quo until the court's ruling. The Trump-era tariffs had immediate measurable economic effects, sending ripples through nearly every sector of the American economy. These policy changes were felt not just by corporations and government officials, but by everyday Americans in their daily lives. Prices on imported goods rose quickly. Studies found that U.S. importers and consumers ended up shouldering nearly all the additional costs, rather than foreign exporters. This meant that the intended pressure on other countries often circled back to American wallets. For consumers, this translated into higher prices on everyday goods, from groceries and clothing to electronics and appliances. Even basic necessities became more expensive, squeezing household budgets across the country. According to J.P. Morgan, the tariffs cost the average American household between $600 and $1,000 per year. For many families, this was a significant hit, especially for those already living paycheck to paycheck. For businesses, especially small and medium-sized ones, production costs surged. Companies faced tough decisions: absorb the higher costs and risk lower profits, raise prices and risk losing customers, or attempt to overhaul their supply chains, an expensive and time-consuming process. While some domestic industries, like steel and aluminum, saw short-term gains and increased hiring, these benefits were often offset by losses in other sectors. Industries that relied on imported materials faced higher input costs, making it harder to compete. The U.S. International Trade Commission found that for every job created in protected industries, more jobs were lost in sectors that used those materials, such as manufacturing and construction. The net effect was negative for overall employment. Retaliatory tariffs from other countries hit U.S. exporters hard, especially farmers. Soybean exports to China, once a major market, plunged by over 70%, leaving many farmers with unsold crops and mounting financial stress. In response, the government spent billions of dollars to bail out affected farmers, providing emergency aid to help them weather the storm. However, many argued that these payments were only a temporary fix. Overall, the tariffs acted as a drag on the U.S. economy, slowing growth and creating uncertainty for businesses and investors. Economists warned that the long-term effects could be even more damaging. The Congressional Budget Office projected lower real incomes for American families and a 0.3% drop in GDP by 2020, underscoring the broad economic impact of the tariffs. Hopes for a manufacturing boom ultimately fell flat, and instead of shrinking, the U.S. trade deficit actually widened, defying the policy's original goals. The global economy's complexity meant tariffs had far-reaching, often unintended consequences. Supply chains shifted, international relationships were strained, and the effects rippled far beyond U.S. borders, highlighting just how interconnected the world's economies have become. The Supreme Court's decision was about law, not policy. The key question: did the executive branch overstep the authority Congress granted in Sections 232 and 301? The majority said yes, citing the non-delegation doctrine. Congress can't hand over its core legislative powers. The court found the administration's use of national security too broad, turning a narrow law into a tool for general protectionism. If national security means anything economic, the president's power would be limitless. violating the Constitution's separation of powers. The court said Section 301 was meant for targeted responses, not sweeping trade wars. The ruling resets the boundaries of presidential power in trade. The 6-3 majority opinion is a forceful check on executive power. The court's core question, who sets trade policy? The answer, Congress, not the president. The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce and impose tariffs. The justices said Congress can't give the president a blank check to tax Americans. If any economic issue is national security, the president could impose tariffs on anything, anytime. The court said sweeping, economy-wide tariffs are a legislative act, not a regulatory tweak. The message, the executive's power ends where Congress's begins. The dissenting justices defended broad presidential authority in foreign affairs and national security. They argued Congress intentionally gave the president wide discretion to act quickly in a complex world. Justice Alito said economic security is national security. A nation dependent on rivals for key goods is vulnerable. The president, as commander-in-chief, must have flexibility to respond, including with tariffs. The dissent noted Congress could have reined in the president but chose not to, implying approval. This sharp split highlights the enduring debate over the balance of power between branches. With the tariff struck down, the immediate effect is relief for importers. Costs will drop almost overnight. Businesses may invest, hire, and stabilize supply chains. Consumers should see lower prices as retailers pass on savings. The tariff tax on goods from washing machines to shoes is gone, boosting purchasing power. Domestic industries that benefited from tariffs, like steel and aluminum, now face renewed foreign competition. The ruling also creates uncertainty in U.S. trade relations, especially with China. Billions in already paid tariffs are in legal limbo, likely triggering lawsuits for refunds. The path forward is a mix of relief, opportunity, and new challenges for the economy. The Supreme Court's decision is a turning point for U.S. trade policy. It reasserts Congress's primary role in regulating foreign commerce. The ruling checks executive power and brings relief to importers and consumers. Domestic industries lose protection, and the U.S. must rethink its trade strategy, especially with China. The legal and financial fallout will unfold for years. The power to shape trade policy returns to Congress, demanding public debate and compromise. The big question, can Congress and the president now forge a coherent long-term trade strategy for America?